this part.
Oh, right. Okay.
It goes right in here.
Okay.
So you could add that to the bag with the mics, and I'll get it tomorrow.
You got it.
You guys probably subscribe to the newsletter, but have you ever subscribed to the e-edition? Not people online.
No.
That's the best way to
to get that from.
It cost half as much. You get it at the fair, so I just paid it for the next year, $52. That's every day. But the thing is, Sargis Download, it's every single page in a download.
Even the ads and everything, huh?
Except for the inserts,
Oh, the inserts.
which I really don't need. But the thing about this is, it's not pictures of words, it's words. So when I save all the articles, if I want to look up whatever, it just comes up, the ones that I save. So I create my own database as I go, and the pictures are also much better, because when you print the newsprint, it's lousy. So I say I don't subscribe to the dead tree version. I like words as opposed to pictures of words. And getting harder and harder to see. I got a cataract one eye, just bump the font up one size.
Go to Johnson.
It's what?
Catherine Johnson.
She's the cataract queen of.
I will.
She's an ophthalmologist.
I'm a youngster. I've got a year and a half till Medicare, so
Oh, well, wait.
Then I get over there.
By that time, who knows whether Medicare will be there or not.
This is who?
Medicare.
And so Catherine Johnson, I guess she's really good.
She's really good.
What I want to do though is examine before I do it. I'll study a bit to see if there's any other alternative to having the plastic conservative. I don't think there is, but there may
Let
be.
me tell you what. We go to an optometrist named Barbara Keys.
Just for
glasses, for getting prescription glasses. And I went to her to get some glasses, and she made an appointment for me. She called up Johnson's office and made an appointment because she thought that's where I should go.
Sure.
She saw something in her eye.
She saw that I had macular degeneration.
As an optometrist, she could see it, but she wanted to refer it to an ophthalmologist.
Well, she can treat it. But anyway, so I had a shot in the eye and, just started on this darn stuff. And I told her that, no, she did a cataract operation on us. And Barbara said, let me see how it looks. And she looked, she said, it's absolutely perfect. She was reporting on Johnson's word. And she was really good.
So they took the cataract out and put the clothes in.
Yeah,
mine too.
And I'm vexed. That's what I have to do. Because I don't.
Well, I hadn't noticed anything. I really didn't notice anything after they've been taken out. I mean, everything looked the same.
Good job, yeah.
You probably noticed that you could see better.
No, I couldn't.
Well, I can't read it from that.
Oh, you can't.
No, it's an injury, and so it'd be nice to read it too.
She puts these in, and there she analyzes the guy and everything, so she can improve your lens right there, and the lens on.
She graduated from Harvard Medical School.
She did. This Catherine Johnson?
Yeah. And then she went to some place in Florida, I suppose Miami, where they worked on nothing but eyes, and she went to school there. And she takes about 9 people a week, and she lines them up in the.
I thought you were saying like 9 people a day.
Well, no, on Mondays, she gets all the people, and then she does all the operation, kind of in an assembly and operation, and then they come back in and
you see all these people you haven't seen for years.
And you can see it.
Well, yeah, it's just the old homework, old homework.
It's like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
But she's pretty good.
Did you?
We came to hear you tonight. Yeah, we're up on eyeballs and everything.
Well, that sounds like a natural segue if I ever heard one. Good evening. I'm Robert Hannon for the University of Alaska Fairbanks Summer Sessions, and I welcome you to this discussion of antibiotic use, overuse, misuse, or old miracle drugs in the age of superbugs. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, a couple of housekeeping things. As you know, you have cell phones, and if you could silence them for the meeting, that would be terrific. I also want to mention some other things that are taking place through summer sessions. For example, tomorrow night, author Debbie Miller talks here in this venue about Journey Up the Yukon. She's a wonderful writer for children and adults, and that should be really interesting. Thursday, in Music in the Garden at the Borgeson Botanical Gardens, Emily Anderson will perform. And then next Monday, Melissa Sykes will talk about incredible Alaskan insects. So those are all something you might want to attend or find out more information. There's a sign-up sheet out on the desk out there where you can sign up for email alerts of upcoming events. So you might want to take advantage of that. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. John Despasquale. He comes to us from American Samoa, where most recently he was Assistant Chief of Pediatrics, Hospitalist, and Medical Epidemiologist at the Tropical Medical Center in Pago Pago. Is that how you pronounce it?
Pongo.
Pongo Pongo. There are actually two places, or they just like that word so much they use it twice. Pongo Pongo. Prior to that, he served as a primary care and urgent care pediatrician at Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Despasquale is a board-certified and postdoctoral trained in pediatric residency at the University of Arizona, and he has a fellowship, or had a fellowship, as an epidemic intelligence service officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. He holds a certificate in travel health from the International Society of Travel Medicine and a diploma of tropical medicine and hygiene from the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. He holds a master's of public health from Georgia State University, a doctorate from Temple University School of Medicine in Philadelphia, and a bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University. He's held several administrative posts and field epidemiological positions, including work as a board member of the Serve Haiti organization. Dr. Despasquale's many awards and honors include a Unit Commendation Award from the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, awarded for establishing influenza sentinel surveillance systems. That's quite alliterative there, in 5 East African nations in 2008. So please welcome Dr. Despasquale.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody, and I hope that we have a good time over the next hour or so. So antibiotic use, overuse, misuse, or old miracle drugs in the age of superbugs. Already it doesn't click. No, I did that on here. So this just went. If it can work, that's great. If you can get it to rework, maybe she can help us.
Yeah, I'll check.
All right. So New York City. Let's take a look at New York City, the 1900s to the 1920s. This is kind of what it looked like on the Lower East Side. It was teeming with people. It was one of the most concentrated group of people in the world at the time. And this is where a young boy in 1928, who was 3 years of age, named Matteo, was diagnosed with pneumonia by a local general practitioner. His parents queried the physician what to do, and he said, take him home, put him to bed. He will either get better or die. My father survived and had very few other infections in his life. But that first one in the pre-antibiotic era could have killed him. And now it's not going with this. And how about this? Good. All right, let's give it a try. Good. So tonight we'll look a little bit about the history of antibiotics and infections, resistant bacteria and antibiotic side effects, the scope of the problem. Is it a real problem or is it not that big of a deal? And maybe some of the solutions to the problem. And then agriculture's contribution to the problem and maybe some solutions there. The news is not all bad. It might sound bad as we go along, but we'll look at what can be done to address this antibiotic resistance issue that we're finding. And I think back to my dad, and this kind of just sparked interest in infectious diseases, and wow, I could have been close to not being here tonight. So let's look back at the ancient times. About 4000 BC in Sumeria, wounds were washed with hot water or beer. And this was kind of the first antisepsis. By 1700 BC in Egypt, they were applying honey to open wounds. And this, believe it or not, is still used today. I've taken care of patients in Peru, and this method was used to treat them, and quite effectively at times. In 460 BC in Greece, they would wash wounds with wine. They would close wounds with sutures soaked in hot oil. And this really was the idea of antisepsis being born. And then interestingly, in Greece at this time, they would apply moldy bread to wounds. It's like, wow, this is like this scary stuff. So let's look at causes of death in war. In the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War, there were 7 times as many deaths due to infection as due to injury. And then in World War I, the tides turned, and there were actually more deaths due to injury by a ratio of 2 to 1. So infections played less of a role, which was nice. By World War II, only 1/10 of the GIs who died from infection. And by the first Gulf War, we were down to about 1% of those who died due to infection. So World War I, why did this happen? Well, this was before the antibiotic era as well. But there were reasons why infections decreased. There was an increased standard of living at the time. There was cleaner water, better nutrition, better hygiene, and really the concept of antisepsis of wounds took hold. The medics really washed out these wounds very vigorously, and that's the first step in preventing infection. And then the advent of tetanus antitoxin. This decreased tetanus deaths by 85% as compared to the earlier wars that were shown up on the previous slide. And these were all public health prevention-related measures. They were not antibiotic-related measures. So a lot of infections can be dealt with and prevented on this basis and not just relying on antibiotics. Let's look at the causes of death in non-war situations. So in 1900, the top 3 causes of death in the United States were related to infection: influenza or pneumonia, tuberculosis, and then intestinal infections. So when I think of intestinal infections, I think of diarrhea. And you're looking at the 0 to 5-year-old age group. Patients with diarrhea in that young age group would often die of their symptoms. And actually, infection accounted for about 50% of deaths at the time. In 2010, none of the top 10 causes of death in the US were from infectious diseases. And infections account for less than 2% of deaths today, of all deaths in the US. If anybody really wants to raise a hand in the middle, I'm more than happy to be interrupted. Otherwise, we'll have questions at the end.
Back in the late 1800s, I guess that's Lister. It was a Lister who was the first one who began washing hands and things.
So
did that make a big difference? Did it catch on, or was it slow?
And it did catch on. The first obstetrician, and I don't remember the name, who began washing hands was ridiculed by his colleagues. And his ward, the women survived. On the other ward, women would often die of postpartum infection. So it was much safer to deliver a baby in your home than at a birthing center or a hospital, because germs live in hospitals. Germs live where there's a lot of sick people. And so that made a huge difference. Huge. So World War I, washing hands, washing wounds, huge. Let's see. So now we're going to enter the antibiotic era. So early attempts at antibiotics, and this is not an exhaustive history by any means. You could do whole courses on this. But in the 1800s, mercury was used to treat syphilis. Really toxic stuff, very dangerous. But by the early 1900s, they came up with something that was safer. It was arsenic-based antibiotic. And there's Dr. Paul Ehrlich and Dr. Sahachiro Hata developed this arsenic-based antibiotic called Salvarsan. And it was considered a great improvement over mercury-containing treatments, but it was far from a miracle drug. It caused severe rashes, liver damage, and described as risks to life and limb. But there were people who were cured from their syphilis. This stuff might not have been a miracle drug, but it made for great drama. And in 1940, there was a movie called The Magic Bullet with Edward G. Robinson, and he played Dr. Paul Ehrlich. So even at the start of movies, people were fascinated with infection and disease and the whole healthcare kind of profession. So let's look at a few definitions and abbreviations for the rest of the talk. Antibiotic. It's a substance that has the capacity to inhibit growth of microorganisms. These can be broken down into four main groups: antibacterial agents, antiviral agents, antiparasitic agents, and antifungal agents. For the purposes of this talk, when I refer to antibiotics, I will mean antibacterial type of antibiotics. Penicillin may be abbreviated as PCN in some of these slides, and antibiotics may be abbreviated as ABX, just to kind of save the space here. So we're going to switch over to the other side of the pond. And in 1928, this is kind of what London looked like. Now, this was a big gathering of people, but London was probably the other city in the world that had this mass, intense density of people. And whenever you have mass, intense densities of people, you also had animals back then, you had garbage back then, and these are places where infections could really spread. This is St. Mary's Hospital in London, and this is where penicillin was first discovered. It was discovered accidentally in 1928 by Alexander Fleming. He was a researcher working with petri dishes that were coated with the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. We know this bacteria today as staph. It's the kind of nickname for it. People come in with a staph infection, for instance. Well, one of his petri dishes was contaminated with mold. The staph grew everywhere on that dish except around the mold. And that mold was called the penicillium mold. And that mold was found to secrete a substance that inhibited bacterial growth. And Fleming didn't call the substance penicillin, he called it mold juice. Mold juice proved to be extremely difficult to isolate and purify. And it took 13 years before a usable form of penicillin could actually be developed. So now we're looking at penicillin, the first use in the early 1940s. It was first used on a civilian with an eye, face, and lung injury, which he contracted from a scratch that he got from a rose bush in his garden. He improved on the penicillin. This was a big, bad infection. But within 5 days, the penicillin ran out. And there was no more penicillin to be had in the world, and the patient died. But that same year, a postpartum woman with an infection was actually cured with a full course of penicillin. Then British soldiers began to be treated and cured. And everybody thought, this stuff is good. It's really a miracle. But it was a successful drug, but it was in a very limited supply. It required 2,000 liters of mold juice to make enough penicillin to treat one patient for a full course of treatment. So what medics did was they started collecting the urine from penicillin-treated GIs and then concentrating that penicillin out and giving it to other patients who were sick. And those other patients would be cured. And that's when the Brits came to the U.S. and said, could you please help us produce this drug? So the U.S. was not in the war at the time, but we started helping the situation by producing the drug. And really, thus, the era of modern antibiotic production was ushered in. And it blossomed. And there were ads all over the place. And I mean, here's like a mailbox or whatever. Penicillin cures gonorrhea in 4 hours. Everybody wanted penicillin, and everybody got penicillin. Of course, not everybody was happy. And this is really the age group that I deal with mostly in pediatrics. This apparently was the mother of the kid. And I couldn't figure out from any of the literature, was the mother a nurse? Was the mother a doctor? Or did the doctor just hand this stuff to her and the kid got the shot? So kids still today react in that same way. So let's look at a few diseases and penicillin. So in World War I, the death rate from pneumonia was 18%. This was the pre-antibiotic era. I think back to my dad as a toddler with pneumonia, 18, 20% death rate. In World War II, the death rate from pneumonia fell to 1%, and that's with the use of penicillin. It's a 95% reduction in mortality. That's major. That's miracle drug. That's a magic bullet. So penicillin kills microbes, in this case bacteria, and saved lives. So streptococci is an example of a bacteria that could be killed. Think of strep throat. Today, this penicillin still works against strep throat. Think of staphylococci. Think of the boils and the skin infections that people get. This is the bacteria that was on Fleming's Petri dish. And think of the Egyptian moldy bread treatment that I mentioned earlier. This may have been penicillin or some form of penicillin, and it actually did work to prevent or cure minor infections. Couldn't cure a major bloodstream infection, but it looked kind of gross, but it was based on science. Diphtheria, throat infections, which severely will constrict the windpipe and cause especially little kids to die. And there was an American who died volunteering in Haiti from diphtheria about 2 or 3, 4 years ago. So it's still out there. The disease is still out there. Well, penicillin would kill that infection. Then there was syphilis, of course. The 3 worst causes of meningitis would be cured by penicillin, and a variety of pneumonias and gonorrhea, and in only 4 hours. So that's the real benefit. So the problem, we have an increasing number of resistant bacteria over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Whoops, let's go back one. I think maybe a slide messed up a little. So there's an increasing number of resistant bacteria. There are also side effects to antibiotics: allergic reactions, secondary infections, and misdiagnoses. So let's look at resistance and how quickly did it develop. So you can see that in 1941, the first doses of antibiotic penicillin were used, and then it became widely used in 1942. In 1942, penicillin resistance is reported in essentially the same year that it began widespread use. In 1959, a medication called methicillin was brought to the market, and 2 years later, in 1961, there was reported methicillin-resistant bacteria. This was Staph aureus. This is abbreviated MRSA, or the bacteria that we know today as MRSA. Have people heard of MRSA? Pretty much, right? Look at the mass resistance that has developed between the year 2000 and the present. There's a whole list of antibiotics. So let's look at a little bit closer at the staph bug and resistance. Penicillin was widely used in the 1940s against staph. As a matter of fact, the definition of penicillin was that it killed staph on the Petri dish. Then it stopped working. So amoxicillin was brought in, and that worked for a while. Then there was Keflex and methicillin, and MRSA was born in the 1960s, that resistant germ. We moved to clindamycin and an antibiotic called Septra, and now we're looking at about 20% resistance today in Fairbanks to these 2 medications. But 80% of the time it still works. Then we have the last big gun. I don't know what happened there. And the last big gun was called Vancomycin. And Vancomycin pretty much killed every staph known to mankind. And then in the year 2008, there were 8 cases of vancomycin resistance in the state of Michigan. And those patients did not fare too well. And that's not called MRSA, but it's called vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus, or VRSA. And after that, I don't know what the next slide is, folks.
I apologize.
All right. No,
If it comes down.
Let's see if it... All right. So let's give it a go. So that was called VRSA. And that's really scary because there's not much after vancomycin that can be used. So what drives this resistance? Well, even with the perfect use of antibiotic, resistance can develop. The bacteria just want to survive. They're trying to eke out a niche for themselves to live. With overuse or misuse of antibiotics, it develops faster. Examples of conditions for which antibiotics are currently being overused or misused. The common cold. If you treat a common cold with an antibiotic, you are overusing antibiotics 100% of the time for that common cold. Bronchitis. 65% of all bronchitises that are treated with antibiotics are overtreated. They don't need the antibiotic because most of them are caused by viruses. Same with the common cold. Antibiotics are antibacterial, not antiviral. Bacteria in urine. Up to 41% of bacteria in urine is overtreated. It's just sitting in there colonized but not causing disease. And then sore throats is probably the most interesting. For kids, up to about 30% of sore throats are caused by strep. The rest are viral, that's 70%. In adults, only 5 to 15% of sore throats are caused by strep, and the rest are viral. So resistance is here, it's here to stay. It's been developing since 1942, the year we started using penicillin in a wide fashion. So resistance develops quickly in response to exposure to antibiotics. The bacteria are evolving to combat antibiotics, and they can do this rather quickly. In World War II, GIs that would come in with recurrent cases of gonorrhea, they would find that higher and higher doses of antibiotics were needed to treat them. And that happened over a period of months. Well, staph infections today, we can test in the lab. They can test sensitive to the antibiotic called clindamycin. And by the end of a 10-day course, if you tested that bacteria again, you might find that those bacteria are now resistant to the clindamycin. It's called inducible resistance.
So I understand that doctors prescribe a 10-day course, but the infection or the symptoms are gone by day 5. So do we continue to take it to the 10th day, or just take it to 5 and then stop because our symptoms have gone away?
So it's a great and very profound question. Generally speaking, what we will say is take the antibiotic for the entire length that your doctor prescribed, because not all of the bacteria will be gone. Maybe enough bacteria are gone to take away the symptoms. But guess which bacteria are killed first? The wimpiest bacteria. And the strongest bacteria, even though there may be only a few of them, are the ones that remain. And then they can propagate, and then they can spread, and they can cause further disease. A perfect example of this is strep throat. Strep throat takes about 10 days to assure that you're going to kill the infection. And the reason you want to kill strep throat, especially in young kids, is you don't want them to get rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever is a horrible disease. We'll touch base on it. We'll touch a little bit on it a little bit later. But the real profound part of the question is 5 days, 10 days? Right now, a lot of scientists are looking at what's the proper duration of antibiotic treatment. And it's probably different for every different infection.
So in the last, 5-6 years, I probably got strep throat twice and probably got 2 different kinds of medication, or the same medication, but I ate it once for 5 days, another time for 10 days. So is that because of me not doing it correctly, or the prescription not being prescribed correctly, or why do these?
Why does it come back?
Yeah.
So if it comes back very quickly, it's likely that you did not take the prescription correctly and finish it. If it came back months later, it was probably a new infection. The other thing is, after kids pass about 18 to 20 years of age, the risks for something like rheumatic fever are a lot less. So the consequences vary based on the age of the patient and the particular disease. And there's a lot of research now. Can we treat pneumonias for 5 days? And that's being looked at without creating this resistant superbug, that last bug that's still in your body, that you don't want it to then propagate. And for some reason, whenever we take a break, it stops. So let's look at what causes bacteria to become resistant? What makes them be able to resist an antibiotic? And there's many different mechanisms, but I just chose 3 here. A bacteria can make its cell wall impenetrable to the antibiotic, and we call that in science porin loss. So think about losing a pore. If that pore is plugged, if that pore is wiped out, an antibiotic can't get into the cell. If it can't get into the cell, it can't kill the cell. The bacteria then can live. There are also pumps. So certain antibiotics can get into a cell, and that cell can pump it right back out, like a sump pump. It can't stay in the cell long enough to actually start killing the bacteria. And the bacteria cells can also produce enzymes that just inactivate the antibiotic once it does get in. And 2 examples of that are something called beta-lactamases and carbapentamases. And these carbapentamases we're going to touch on a little bit later. They are found in bugs called KPC and CRE. So just remember those, and we'll get back to them. The C in both of these acronyms is carbapenem or carbapenamase. And then there are combinations. Some bacteria that are really super smart, way smarter than me, will combine multiple forms of resistance, and those are really hard infections to kill. Yeah, this is no longer working. And this, oh, all right, there we go. So now we're going to look at an outbreak at an extended care nursing facility in Florida. This is like a nursing home, but with an advanced level of care. So there were patients on ventilators, there were patients who had catheters in place, and these were pretty high-risk patients. There were 13 patients identified with an infection caused by bacteria called Klebsiella. It's just a bacteria. You don't have to worry about the nature of it. This bacteria was resistant to all standard antibiotics, including the carbapenems, often thought of as the strongest last resort antibiotics. So this was quite a worry. This was the first outbreak of this type in Florida, and it took place in 2007. At the time, there were only 3 other states that had similar outbreaks. 9 of the 13 patients died, which means a 65% mortality rate. These bacteria resisted antibiotic penetration of the cells, so we determined that they had porin loss. And then what little antibiotic got into the cells was destroyed by the carbapenemase. And so the KPC stands for the Klebsiella bacteria, and the C is it produced a carbapenemase, and it inactivated our last hope for treating these patients with antibiotics. And therefore, 9 of the 13 died. So if we look at the graph in 2001, there was 1 state, North Carolina, that had a patient with a KPC infection. When we did the investigation in 2007, we were the 4th state. By 2012, look at the dark colors. All of the dark colors had KPC infections. Only the few light color states escaped. But by 2014, only 2 years later, 49 states had this type of resistant bacteria, and Alaska right now is the lone holdout. Am I still correct that we're the lone holdout? I'm getting a yes from the bacteriologist in the audience. Thanks. This is going to change. We will get this infection here. People fly here all the time. People get sick here. People go to the hospital here.
Do plasmids, there's kind of a swap meet that they have, these organisms. Right?
Yeah, so this is a mechanism that I've not talked about. I'm not talking about in this talk today, but plasmids are little bits of genetic material different from the main DNA of the bacteria, and they trade these plasmids between bacteria back and forth. And many of these plasmids hold the genes for bacterial resistance. So not only are they working individually to come up with mechanisms to save their particular cell, but they're talking to each other. They're in cahoots. They are trying to survive as an entire community. So plasmids are a huge factor in this. So what was the initial solution to the resistance problem? And it was new antibiotic development. So science met the challenge. Newer, stronger antibiotics were developed, and they kept pace with bacteria's ability to develop resistance for a while. So let's look at antibiotic development. Remember I talked about salvarsan and penicillin? They were developed in 1910 and 1930. But then look at all of these vertical lines in the middle of the chart. And this really was the golden age of antibiotics from 1945 to 1975. So all of this time period, there were all these antibiotics that were developed. But these aren't individual antibiotics. These are classes of antibiotics. So each one of those is an entire class of antibiotics with many antibiotics falling within that class. Whoops. See, something happened. Well, something's happening with the slides. But look over to the right. I had a square around that, and that was called the discovery void. And, oh, all right, you know what? I think, let me go back. Let's see. All right, golden age of antibiotics, Marcus Welby. I'm sorry I messed that up. This was the time where it must have been really fun because these docs were around pre-antibiotic, then post-antibiotic, and they saw the miracle that was going on. Now we get to this last part where the box is around, and it's called the discovery void. And this is 1980 to the present. We're going to look at this period of discovery void a little bit more closely. So here we have multiple 5-year periods. 1983 to 1987 is the first. There were 16 individual antibiotics, not classes of antibiotics, but individual antibiotics that were developed during this time. And then each succeeding 5-year period, fewer and fewer antibiotics were brought to market. And between 2008 and 2012, we've had a total of 2 antibiotics brought to market. This is a discovery void. These are being harder and harder to develop and to bring to market, and we'll get into some reasons why a little bit. So we have the increasing number of resistant bacteria, but we also have, and now we have fewer antibiotics to fight them. We're not keeping up with the pace of the bacterial resistance. Now we have side effects of antibiotics, allergic reactions, secondary infections, and misdiagnoses. So that's allergic reactions. Even with proper use of antibiotics, allergic reactions will happen. And these reactions can be life-threatening. Up to 500 people in the United States die each year from penicillin allergy in the US. As a community, we're willing to accept some of this because we know that far more people are going to be helped with the antibiotics than harmed with a serious allergic reaction. So it's a risk-benefit. But it would be a shame to be giving antibiotics needlessly and to have one of your patients come down with a serious reaction or even possible death. So it's a concern. It's something that we take into account every day. Let's look at secondary infections. The stronger the antibiotic, and by that we kind of mean the more broad spectrum, the more bugs that a given antibiotic can kill, it's easier for secondary infections to occur. Because think of it, antibiotics kill the bad bacteria you want to kill, and then they kill all sorts of your good bacteria. So killing the good makes room for the bad to flourish. That's not too hard to understand on an intellectual basis. So examples of that are common would be a vaginal yeast infection in a woman, baby's severe diaper rash or thrush in the mouth. We see these all the time as common side effects of antibiotics. But there are some more serious ones. And the one is called Clostridium difficile, or what a lot of people call C. diff. This is an intestinal infection, and it causes bloody diarrhea, abdominal pain, often hospitalization, occasionally a ruptured intestine, and more than occasionally, death. So we'll get back to that one in a little bit and try to tie this all in together in the end. So there are many, for misdiagnosis, there are many viral infections in the world. And many of these viral infections come with rashes. Just happens to be that's the way they happen. Think of measles as a kid, German measles, chicken pox. Well, doctors prescribe antibiotics for viral infections, and that's really a bad use of antibiotics. You start the antibiotic, a few days later, guess what? Your viral infection causes a rash. A rash comes out. The patient or the physician or provider misdiagnoses this rash as an allergy to antibiotics. So in the future, when a patient becomes ill, the doctor looks at the record and says, oh, you had a reaction to this antibiotic. We're going to have to give you a different antibiotic. And oftentimes you're bypassing the simple common antibiotics and you're going to something that's stronger. Well, the stronger antibiotics have more side effects, more opportunity for resistance to develop. So you always want to go with the simplest, narrowest spectrum antibiotic that you think is going to work. So a review of the problems again, increasing numbers of resistance, and then these side effects that we have to take into account. So let's put the problem into perspective a little bit. Is this a big problem? Is it not so big of a problem? Am I making a big deal out of not much? Because heck, why not just give everybody antibiotics? What if they have a bacterial infection? At least you're covering for it, right? That's not the way to think. So antibiotics, whether used appropriately or not, put pressure on bacteria to develop resistance. The more antibiotics that are used, the more pressure. The CDC, or Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, estimates that up to half of all antibiotics in the United States are prescribed needlessly. So resistance develops and causes infections that are, one, harder to treat, more expensive to treat because the antibiotics get more and more expensive, more likely to require hospitalization, and are more likely to cause death.
What about the antibacterial soaps and the antibacterial hand washes and the antibacterial wipes that we're told that we have to just to have the whole spectrum in our bag, just have everything?
And it's, again, you're asking great questions. There's some research now being done on those. We know for the most part that the antibiotic solutions that we use in the hospital can really pretty much sterilize the hands. And those would be called antiseptics and not really antibiotics. And they seem to have been holding their own for a while. But there's a chemical called triclosan, and it's in some of the antibacterial soaps. And they're starting to look at resistance to the ingredients of these antibacterial soaps that you can buy over the counter. Most experts are saying regular soap and water and good hand washing is what's needed to prevent most transmission of infection. But they're looking into it more. Let's put some numbers to the problem.
Every once in a while, you see a little jar in a store or something like that, you can push it and I assume that's some kind of a bacterial agent.
And that's,
we have to overuse that.
And that's, so far, no. So far, we seem to be holding our own with that. That's an alcohol base, and 70% alcohol-based solutions seem to do a pretty good job on the hands. Is something going to become resistant to that in the future? It is possible. That's going to be a day that I'm not going to be too interested in seeing. It's better to wash your hands with those than cough into your hands, touch the rail, and then somebody picks up that cart right after you. So there is still use for those. Probably does not replace good hand washing. Right now, they're working. So let's put some numbers to the problem. In the U.S., resistant bacteria cause greater than 2 million resistant infections per year. That's a big number. There are greater than 23,000 deaths per year in the United States due to resistant infections. Let's look at 3 examples. C. difficile colitis causes 250,000 of illnesses and 14,000 deaths per year. 85% of C. difficile patients have received an antibiotic in the prior 30 days. This infection is caused by the use of antibiotics. Resistant Klebsiella, remember I called it KPC? The resistant form of this bug has a 2.5 times death rate compared to susceptible Klebsiella strains of antibiotic. And MRSA infections, twice the death rate compared to sensitive staphylococcal strains, the ones that will be killed by regular antibiotics. So the numbers are pretty staggering. How about the dollars? Resistant infections often require more costly, broad spectrum, or stronger antibiotics, more time to heal, more frequent hospitalizations, and longer stays in the hospital, and more ER visits. The cost is estimated to be $20 billion in excess medical costs and $30 billion in lost productivity. This is per year, just in the US, and the problem is worldwide. So the worldwide figures are kind of staggering when you think about it. So what's the solution? Well, develop new antibiotics, sounds good, prevent disease, develop novel infection-fighting methods, and use antibiotics wisely, don't overuse them and don't misuse them. None of these are simple. Develop new antibiotics. Remember, we're in the period of antibiotic discovery void. We haven't come up with new ones. Why are we in this void, and what can be done to produce more and better antibiotics? Well, we're trying, but it cost about $1 billion and 10 years to bring antibiotics to the market. Fewer companies are willing to make this investment. And listen to this reasoning. So an antibiotic comes to market, it's used, and we know for a fact that resistance is going to develop. Therefore, when resistance develops, it's prescribed less, there are fewer prescriptions, and the company makes less money. All right? Say they come out with the next penicillin, the next miracle drug. If that drug is very good, really smart doctors and really smart hospitals say they want to limit the use of that drug to only the most severe life-threatening infections. Well, if we're going to limit the use of the drug, there are fewer prescriptions, and the pharmacy company makes less money. All right? So, in addition, the low-lying fruit has probably been picked. It was easy to modify the first molecules of antibiotics, and it's becoming much and much harder to modify them. So there's some scientific reasons that we're not producing as much either. But that money thing is a big one, I bet. Then there are lifestyle drugs. Think Viagra. Think chronic drugs for cholesterol and blood pressure. These medications are used by patients for years or decades and not weeks, like antibiotics. There's a lot of money when you have somebody on a drug for 20, 30, or 40 years, and as opposed to two weeks or 1 week or maybe 5 days. So antibiotics are the future. They're looking at targeting specific bacterial DNA. If you can find a certain gene in one type of bacteria and you can kill or deactivate that gene, you kill the bacteria, and you've only killed one kind of bacteria. You've left all the other bacteria in the body okay. So this is called a very narrowing of the spectrum of antibiotic use. Some people would say it's weaker, it's not killing as much. But that's exactly what you want. You want just the right antibiotic to kill just the infection that you have and not kill everything else. This limits side effects, which is a very nice thing. There's some thought about an antibiotic that wouldn't kill the bacteria, but that deactivates the toxin and that a bacteria produces. And diphtheria is a toxin-producing bug. And it's that toxin that caused the swelling of the throat and these kids to die from diphtheria. And so if you just could deactivate the toxin, you wouldn't even touch the other bacteria that are in the body. Using silver additives to antibiotics can help increase the antibiotic's ability to enter a cell. This is some areas of research that are going on, but nothing seems to be on the immediate horizon.
Silver as the mineral?
Silver as in the metal. Yeah, so we're talking about elemental silver, and I am not a pharmaceutical microbiologist, but they're looking at all sorts of novel ways of trying to deal with some of these issues. But the big point here is none of this is like going to come out next week. Can we prevent disease? Sure. Sometimes just living right, so eating right, exercising, don't overeat, don't overuse alcohol, don't use tobacco products at all. These are tough lifestyle issues, and it's been tough to get Americans to adopt this. It's not easy. And this wouldn't protect you from all infections by any means, but it's important. Let's look at vaccination as another way to prevent disease. This, in many ways, is easier to do. You just go in and you get the shot. We do recommend staying up to date on all recommended vaccines. And there are really two classes of vaccines. You have the antibacterial vaccines, and then you have the antiviral vaccines. Well, antibacterial vaccines against things like there's pneumococcal infection. So that's Prevnar and Pneumovax. There's a meningococcal infection. That's the one that causes fingertips and toe tips and noses to fall off. We have a vaccination against that. And then, of course, there's the diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, and that's called the DPT. So those are obvious. You prevent bacterial infection, you have to use less antibiotics to treat infection. And we're talking millions of doses less antibiotic. Then there are antiviral vaccines, and we know these as the measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, polio, hepatitis, and others. Of course, the flu vaccine is in that. And the reason these help in terms of antibiotics is not that these are antibiotic-prone diseases, but you get a lot of secondary infections when you have really bad viruses. And antibiotics can help prevent, the vaccine can help prevent the virus. If you prevent the virus, you prevent the secondary infection. Therefore, you don't need antibiotics. So that brings us to the last great race. And as you can tell, I am horrible with technology, but every good website I have found in the last 20 years has a countdown clock. And when I put this slide up here, there were 223 days, 1 hour, 40 minutes, and 7 seconds left till the next Iditarod. So just in case anybody wanted to know. Why am I bringing this up? Because diphtheria in Alaska. So the Great Race of Mercy, or the Serum Run. In 1925, deaths from diphtheria were going out of control in Nome. There was a limited supply of antitoxin, or serum, in the town. Over a 5-day period, a relay of mushers and dog teams delivered serum to Nome to treat and prevent a more widespread outbreak. Well, the lower 48 states apparently were fascinated with this story, and they followed it as it was going along. And it spurred widespread interest and acceptance of immunization over the next decades. The lead dog, Balto, became a celebrity, as many of you know, and he did a tour after this, and he included New York City, and there's a statue of Balto in Central Park in New York City. This was 17 years before the first available antibiotic. So I consider Alaska to be really kind of pivotal in the whole kind of vaccine, immunization, bacterial, era, and kind of starting it in some way. So develop novel infection-fighting methods. I don't know how many of you were here for the really super presentation about some of these complementary and alternative methods of healthcare that we learned from Dr. Capistrant. So how about boosting the immune system? Great idea. Do the natural products, do the echinaceas, do the vitamins work? Can acupuncture and other complementary approaches work? This stuff is being studied. How about probiotics? Think of the good bacteria that's in yogurt, helping to fight off the bad bacteria. We use it all the time when we give kids antibiotics, but we don't have really strong, super hard data that it works, in a statistically significant way. But we're working on it. Prebiotics are actually substances that promote the growth and health of probiotics. So they're substances that help the good bacteria grow inside of us. And then there's something called phages, which is quite interesting, and it's kind of hearkening back to older times. A phage is a virus that aims to kill bacteria but doesn't hurt human beings. And this was used in the former Soviet Union for decades. Dr. Capistrant talked to us a little bit about the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine and the University of Arizona, their integrative medicine program. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this. Nothing is really on the horizon here. And I think, this is just my opinion, these will be used to keep us healthy, to prevent infection when we're exposed, but probably not going to be a life-threatening, a life-saving treatment in somebody who is, deathly ill. But it's right for research, and of course, nothing on the horizon just yet. So, what about using antibiotics wisely? Don't overuse them and don't misuse them. This brings up the concept of antibiotic stewardship. So the definition of the word stewardship, it's the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. It's the care, handling, and management of resources. The responsible planning and management of resources that can be applied to the environment, to economics, to health, to property, to information, or theology. Obviously, we're concentrating on health today. So let's look at antibiotic stewardship in particular. And this could be considered to be the wisest use of antibiotics, or choosing the narrowest spectrum of antibiotics to get the job done. Another way of saying this is name the bug or name the infection, and then choose the drug, the best drug to kill that infection. Another way of saying it would be the right drug in the right dose, and then hearkening back to the question, for the right length of time. We don't want to treat longer than is necessary, and we don't want to treat shorter. We have not been good stewards. Like I had mentioned, up to 50% of antibiotics are used inappropriately, either overused or misused. I had an example of that in my practice today. 30% of antibiotics used in hospitals are thought to be used inappropriately. So remember that resistance, overuse or misuse, drives resistance, which in turn drives the costs, the side effects, the morbidity or illness, the mortality or death. And I gave you some of those statistics earlier for a few bacterial infections. Hospitals are developing antibiotic stewardship programs all around the country now. And some examples of program activities within these groups of antibiotic stewards. Automatic antibiotic timeouts, that a doctor has to look at those culture results that were obtained, has to stop, and then has to say, are we on the right antibiotic, or do we need this antibiotic at all? And then has to re-prescribe it. It's a step, it's maybe a little bit of a pain, but it can be used to avoid just forgetting that a patient is on an antibiotic for 2, 3, 4, 5 days too long. Pharmacy checks to prevent duplication of antibiotics. Oftentimes more than one antibiotic is prescribed for a patient in the hospital. We want to make sure that we're not duplicating what the antibiotics can do. And then standing orders or routine orders that nurses can follow to remove catheters like urinary catheters or IV catheters and switch them out so that these things that are entering the patient's body are not left in too long, and that a clean one can be put in if need be. Anytime you breach the body's defenses, you open it up to infection. There are some other programs that revolve on education, like keeping doctors up to date on what bacteria are resistant in their community. What are some of the best prescribing routines for certain infections that like are urinary tract and pneumonias. We often overtreat pneumonias. Education for doctors to switch from an IV antibiotic to a PO antibiotic quicker. Get those IVs out. And antibiotic stewardship program team members are working with infection control committees in hospitals to reduce infections that are acquired within hospitals. So this is kind of the trend that we're seeing now. So we're going to look at, do stewardship programs work? Is this just another way of spending money and increasing medical costs, or do they work? So let's look at stewardship programs and secondary infections, bacterial resistance rates, infection cure rates, and cost of care. So stewardship and secondary infection with C. difficile. Remember, 85% of patients with C. difficile have received antibiotics in the 30 days prior. There's a certain kind of antibiotic called a fluoroquinolone, and many of you have heard of the antibiotic called Cipro. This is one of the most common antibiotics prescribed that leads to C. difficile infection. Here's an example in a hospital where C. difficile infections were going up. At start of an antibiotic stewardship program, and very quickly, C. difficile infections dropped. We're not talking about a year later. We're talking about each month there were reductions. Here is an example from a hospital from our neighbors to the east. So it's a Canadian hospital in Quebec. There's that yellow squiggly line. That is the decrease in use of a given antibiotic in that hospital. The blue vertical lines show a decrease in the number of C. difficile infections. And it mimicked, so as the antibiotics were dropped, the C. difficile infections dropped. Less C. difficile infections, less death. So do stewardship programs work? Yes, and they decrease C. difficile rates.
Who keeps track of the drop in the rate? Does infection control do that?
So generally speaking, in hospitals, infection control will do a lot of that work. Antibiotic stewardship program team members will do some of that work. Bigger hospitals, like university hospitals, 500, 1,000 bed type hospitals, have a position called a hospital or medical epidemiologist, whose sole job is to track these things. And they're usually an MD with infectious disease training and then epidemiology training, often through the CDC. The CDC also mandates reporting of all hospitals for certain infections. C. difficile is one of those. The C. difficile statistics come usually from the CDC and some other groups as well. And so they have an entire hospital infection-based team of epidemiologists, and it's a very huge team of people. It's one of the big things that CDC does. So those are about the groups that do it. Is the data all accurate? Probably not, but there are outside groups that monitor this.
So does FMH and the hospitals in Fairbanks have a program like this?
So FMH for a long time has had infection control committee and has not had a formal antibiotic stewardship committee. These are kind of coming into fashion now, but the infection control committee did about half of the things that an antibiotic stewardship committee would do. So we've been doing this, we're trying to do more of this, and we are ramping up to develop a formalized committee to work on it. Committee sounds so bad. It's like it's a work group. But we'll be working with the committee, we'll be working with the doctors. We want to work with some community doctors because a lot of antibiotics are prescribed in the outpatient setting and not the inpatient setting. Probably more antibiotics in the outpatient setting. So there's a lot of this is just really complicated, and there's a lot of different aspects of the problem. So how about drug resistance rates? Well, let's see about before and after limiting antibiotic use. Here's the name of a bacteria. It's not that important what it is, but they looked at this bacteria and they looked at these 5 antibiotics. And was the bacteria resistant or sensitive to these? And before, what they called their, I think it was antibiotic restriction program or whatever. There were about 60 to 80% of these bacteria were sensitive. So 20 to 40% resistance. They limited the use of one class of antibiotics, and over the course of the next year or two, the sensitivity went up to 80 to 90% sensitive. So we're looking at 10 to 20% resistance instead of 20 to 40% resistance. So the key is that bacteria will lose their ability to resist antibiotics if they're given a break from those antibiotics. It's kind of interesting. Do stewardship programs work? Yes, they reduce resistance. Stewardship and infection cure rates. But what do we really care about is, are the patients getting better? That's what we care about. The money is important, all this other stuff is important, but does the patient individual get better? And that's what an individual doctor wants to know. So there was a study at University of Pennsylvania Hospital, which is a world-renowned hospital, and theirs was called the Antimicrobial Management Program. And they had part of the hospital under this management program and the other part of the hospital doing what they called the usual practice. And after reviewing the 2 arms of this study, they found that those who were in the management program prescribed antibiotics appropriately, whatever that meant, about 90% of the time. In the usual practice, now these are Ivy League physicians. These are not wimps here. 30% appropriate antibiotic use when reviewed. So that's one of the advantages of having a formalized program. How about cure rates? Cure rates under the management program, about 90%. Cure rates in the usual practice program were closer to 55%. Failure rates, very few failures when management program was instituted, and more failures when it wasn't. So do antibiotic stewardship programs work? Yes. They improve clinical outcomes. So how about the cost of care? This is a big issue. We are the most expensive cost of care in the world. 14 hospitals. The arrows show a mean of the total costs incurred by a hospital for antibiotic purchases. Hospitals A through E are below the mean cost. Hospitals F through N are above the mean cost. The stewardship hospitals were A through E, and the non-stewardship hospitals were whatever, F through N. So they cut the cost of care because they decreased the use of antimicrobials or antibiotics by 22 to 36%. And they had an annual savings of $200,000 to $900,000. This was done in larger hospitals and smaller community hospitals, and it's been looked at over the past 34 years or so. So does stewardship programs work? Yes, they cut cost of care. So let's review. Secondary infection rates decreased. Bacterial resistance rates decreased. Infection cure rates increased. and cost of care decreased. This is something we can do today. We don't have to wait for the next miracle drug. This is why we're doing these type of programs today. So something completely different. I think it's just 2 slides. Agriculture. This is astounding. 80% of antibiotics used in the US are used in the agricultural setting. There are 3 main areas of antibiotic use for farm animals. One is treatment of infection. The next is prevention of infection. And the next is growth promotion. Antibiotics are added for growth promotion to animal feed and water. They occur in small doses, and these small doses kill off the wimpy bacteria and that the strong ones survive and flourish. These antibiotics are eventually consumed by humans who are consuming the products of agriculture. 80% of all antibiotics use in the US is for farm animals, I said. 80% of antibiotics given to farm animals are used for growth promotion, so having nothing to do with infection. This is a driver of resistance. The antibiotics get into the meat, then into the soil, in the stool. They eventually get into the vegetables, which are grown in the soil. They get into the water. Humans, when they consume the meat, vegetables, and water, get the antibiotics in their bodies. So we probably all have very low levels of antibiotics. This is a huge driver of resistance because overall there's a huge amount of antibiotics used. There are 2 big associated risks here. Risk number 1, resistant bacteria in our meat. 65% of chicken breasts and 44% of ground beef had bacteria resistant to tetracycline. 11% of pork chops had bacteria resistant to 5 classes of antibiotics in one study. This is CDC, USDA, and FDA work. So if handled improperly, or the food is cooked poorly, a consumer can acquire one of these resistant infections. Number 2 is the low levels of these antibiotics in humans. Therefore, we have antibiotics, and in our system, we are putting pressure on our bacteria to develop resistance to them. So, Johns Hopkins is doing a lot of work. We're trying to avoid turkeys that look this way. The School of Public Health is working with the CDC, with the FDA, and they're really trying to kind of work towards this problem. It gives pharmacology a new spin. So solving the agricultural problem, a big part of this can be eliminate antibiotics as a growth enhancer. Europe does not use these as growth enhancers. The FDA is working on this right now. There are some voluntary programs currently in force, but right now, prescriptions are an over-the-counter item. These antibiotics are not prescribed with veterinary supervision, so any farmer could provide this to the animals. If we stopped growth enhancer antibiotics, we could eliminate 64% of all antibiotics used in the United States. 80% for farm animals, 80% of those for growth enhancement, 80 times 80, 64%. It's huge. All right, quiz time. Unfortunately, I was going to roam around with this. So quiz question number 1. Nobody who I know or works at the hospital is allowed to answer this question. What was the name of the antibiotic in mold juice?
Penicillin.
You get the first prize, which is a book on staying healthy while you're traveling. Talks a little bit about antibiotics, talks about immunizations, and other just common sense things. In which major U.S. military conflict did non-infectious causes of death surpass infectious causes? World War I. Scream it out so I can hear.
World War I.
Today, how many of the top 10 causes of death in the U.S. are infection-related?
1%.
How many of the top 10? So give me a number 1 through 10. If you looked at the top 10 causes, how many of them are infectious causes? 0. So that's the benefit of antibiotics. We have turned the top 3 causes of death into not even appearing in the top 10 anymore. What percentage of C. difficile colitis are associated with antibiotics in the prior 30 days? 85%. So it's really huge. I mean, could you imagine eliminating 85? It's like giving penicillin to people with pneumonia in World War II. We went down by about 95%. If we could get rid of this bug, 85%, it's amazing. Agriculture accounts for what percentage of total antibiotic use in the United States? You guys can get this book. It's good. It's a handout we give at our travel medicine clinic, and just has a lot of good common sense. Stay healthy when you're traveling. Avoid infections. Summary: antibiotics are a godsend. Cure bacterial infections, save lives, decrease suffering. But many infections do not require antibiotics. So back to the common cold, simple uncomplicated bronchitis, the flu. Flu you can get an antiviral for, but not an antibacterial. Viral meningitis, viral causes of diarrhea. And actually antibiotics make viral diarrheas worse. Mononucleosis, known as mono. Antibiotics can make that condition worse. Yes, antibiotics for strep throat. Not sore throats, but documented strep throats. We want to prevent rheumatic fever. This is a big issue. When I worked in the Samoan Islands, we had something about 476 kids in our rheumatic fever clinic. And these are kids who had heart failure, who had heart valve transplants, and kids who we saw die. We don't see it as much in the US because of antibiotics. Bacterial pneumonia, almost 100% curable as long as you don't get one of those really bad bugs. And pneumonias were often fatal without antibiotics. Think back to World War I and World War II, how it changed with the use of antibiotics. Infections in immunocompromised patients, you usually need antibiotics. Infections in newborns, bacterial STDs, and bacterial meningitis and blood infections, all really important to use antibiotics. They're life-saving. So what is one to do? What a patient can do. Don't demand your physician give you an antibiotic. Don't put that pressure on the physician or the provider. If an antibiotic is suggested by your healthcare provider, ask them, is this required? Are there alternatives? Can we drain the abscess and not treat it with an antibiotic, for instance? Can an antibiotic be delayed until the culture results are back? I saw a patient today who got antibiotics. The strep throat test was negative. They were never told to stop the antibiotics. They just continued on them. Ask your doctor, is this the narrowest spectrum antibiotic that you can give me for my infection? You don't want the strong one, the wide spectrum one. If it's a strep throat, generally penicillin is good. You don't want Augmentin, which is a broader spectrum antibiotic, more side effects. Take antibiotics as prescribed, complete the course, and how long the course is kind of a moving target right now. For strep, it's 10 days.
So why are we asking the physician all this? Shouldn't they be doing this?
I think this is going, there is no simple answer here. We'll get to what the physician can do. But you can ask you can ask your doctor this. You have the right to ask your doctor this. This is a partnership. This is not as paternalistic as it was in Marcus Welby's day, who just patted you on the back, gave you something, you said, thank you, doctor. You can ask questions. And asking questions and having patients hold doctors accountable can be a good thing. Ask your doctor to wash his or her hands in the room in front of you. Clean their stethoscope with a little alcohol. Staph infections and strep infections of the skin. And ask your doctor to provide you with any needed immunizations. What physicians can do, explain to a patient why an antibiotic is not always needed. That takes time. The more time you take, the less money the doctor makes. He's seeing fewer patients. She's seeing fewer patients. But that's what a physician needs to do. Physicians need to keep up to date on the best practices related to antibiotic prescribing. I almost pulled the remaining few hairs out of my head today when I was dealing with this kid that was just not managed well. Know the bacterial sensitivity data in your community and participate in antibiotic stewardship programs. And doctors, wash your hands and wash your stethoscopes in front of the patients every single time. What governments can do. Can they mandate agricultural limitations on antibiotic use? It's a thought. They're looking into this. Incentivize universities and pharmaceutical firms to continue antibiotic research and development. Right now, they're not finding they're making enough money, which is hard to believe, but that's what we're up against. So can governments have some role there? Internationally, many antibiotics are available over the counter. Should this practice be changed? Remember, we are interconnected now. In the year 2013, 1.1 billion people crossed international borders. And those are people just visiting around. Alaska, we get patients. Everybody's a patient to a doctor. We get visitors from all over the world, and they can bring in all sorts of resistant infections. So that's kind of an interesting question. What can scientists do? Continue research, develop novel antibiotics, develop better and safer vaccines, because they can play a big role. And then this last one comes from the bacterial laboratories. Develop better, faster, more accurate diagnostic tests so the physician has as quick information as possible. If we can diagnose that this blood infection is this bug and this antibiotic's going to work against it, and we can do that in 6 hours, we can pick the right antibiotic the first time and not have to wait 2, 3, 4 days while the patient's getting multiple antibiotics. That's technology. What agriculture can do, stop use as a growth promoter. Use antibiotics to treat animals with veterinary guidance. Just a minute. Europe does this now. It would make meat in the US quite a bit more expensive, though. So it's touchy. What pharmaceutical industry can do, continue research, et cetera, and what hospitals can do. Hand hygiene. We have a big hand hygiene program at the hospital. They watch us like hawks, and they report to us if you're washing your hands or not. Automatic catheter removals, automatic IV removals, infection control committees, and antibiotic stewardship programs. Parting points. Antibiotics are the only class of medication where use in one patient can impact its effectiveness in another patient. That does not happen with a high blood pressure medicine, and it doesn't happen with Viagra. Antibiotics are a shared and scarce resource, hence that stewardship of resources concept. We must all use antibiotics well in order to prevent the consequences of widespread antibiotic resistance. There are no superheroes on the horizon here. I guess Robin was kind of impetuous, and Batman would put him in his place. Hopefully the chief of antibiotic stewardship is not going to take this approach with the rest of the staff. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Everything I said today could be wrong for individual patients. It's right for the masses, but you have to really work with your doctor on what an individual situation is, because human beings are ultimately complex. So there are no simple solutions. Many multidisciplinary research approaches needed. Vaccines have an important role to play. The goal is to avoid a post-antibiotic era and people are prophesying that this is going to happen, that one day we will have no antibiotics to fight these infections. We don't want that to happen. And antibiotic stewardship is something that can be done today, and the patients, the doctors, the hospitals can all work together to make that be. There are plenty of resources online, and this is one website that I thought was interesting. They bring into account the docs, the patients, the public health groups, and as well as the farms and the agricultural use. All you got to do is Google antibiotic resistance, and there's a wealth of information. So that's kind of what I had to say. I'm sorry I ran about 15 minutes late, but we answered questions in the midst of it. So if anybody needs to leave, I've been told, feel free to get up and go, and if anybody has more questions, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, if 80% of antibiotics in the United States are in agriculture, you mean meat. And because I'm thinking, why put in a potato? But it's meat.
So it would be farm animals.
And 80% is growth hormone. I'm not a vegetarian, but when I'm in the United States, should I be?
Well, the articles that I read on this topic say that vegetarians are not immune from this problem, because the antibiotic goes into the soil, in the animal's pee, the animal's poo. Those are pediatric terms. There are more scientific terms for pee and poo, but we don't use them in my field. It goes into the water supply. Vegetables are grown in this soil. So would it help? It would help to be a vegetarian, but there are other disadvantages of being a vegetarian in terms of there are certain very good nutrients in meats, and you have to be careful of iron intake. So there's pros and cons on both sides. You would have less risk of bacterial infection if you were a vegetarian. You would probably not have less risk of some antibiotics getting into your system.
It sounds like you're saying it'd be safer to eat meat in Europe than eat vegetables in the States.
It would be safer to eat meat in Europe for sure than meat in the States from the standpoint of antibiotics. Now, if you cook meat well, you should be fine in terms of acquiring a bad bacteria. And that's, there's just a lot less raw meat being served these days. And that's probably an important thing. So you can still eat meat safely. I'm not a vegetarian either, and I've never gotten sick as far as I know, but I bet you I have some antibiotics in my system from the antibiotic industry. I mean, 80% of all antibiotics. It's a lot. It's out there. The stuff gets, and antibiotics that we use at home, we don't want to flush down into the toilet or down the sink because that goes into the water supply. And these things are hard to get out of the water supply.
Today's topic, but Ebola. Is that a virus or, and how much, well, did you have any comments on this Ebola situation in 3 states and countries in Africa?
In Africa, yeah. So Ebola is a virus, and Ebola, and I'm not an Ebola expert, but Ebola is a virus that is not very infectious. And what I mean by that is it's not terribly easy to transmit Ebola from one person to another. Does it happen? Yes. If you're caring for somebody who's sick and you get their secretions, it can happen. But there are far more infectious diseases. So diseases that are airborne. Measles is the most infectious disease known to mankind. In the old days, a kid with measles would come into a pediatric office and be there for 45 seconds. Everybody in that office would get measles who was not previously immune. The most infectious disease. It's the disease that refugee camp workers fear the most. If there are refugees coming into a refugee camp, the first vaccine they get is measles. Super infectious. Ebola is super virulent, super pathogenic. If it gets in you, you got about a 50% chance of living. And that's different from the definition of infectious. Transmissibility is there, but the virulence of the virus is severe. And right now it does not transmit by airborne. So, and there is no antibiotic because antibiotics don't kill viruses. Antivirals kill viruses. And it seems that for most viruses, immunizations work better than antiviral agents. But right now, there's no immunization for Ebola either. So it's going to be quite interesting to see where we go. This is the worst outbreak from the data that I've looked at the CDC of all Ebola outbreaks over the last 20 or 30 years. I know you had another question.
I got a phone call from Fred Myers a couple of days ago telling me that I cannot, kids or people with compromised immune systems should not eat the peaches or the nectarines. Which, is like I'm not very old, but in my life, it's like the first time when I've heard something like that. That, fruit is being recalled.
And I don't know, has anybody else heard of
Listeria?
Listeria? Yeah. All right. So Listeria is a bacteria that is particularly bad for pregnant women and young babies. And I have not read the outbreak, so I don't know the details of it. Tree fruit is usually better than ground fruit in terms of infectivity. So mangoes don't usually transmit too many diseases, but raspberries do. Blueberries do. Anything that's close to the ground where there is fertilizer and soil can be contaminated with feces from animals or sewage systems or water systems. But by the time water goes up a tree and nourishes a fruit that's hanging from the tree, there's usually less issue. But Listeria is a serious bacteria.
So I have a follow-up question. So in a situation like this where, it doesn't matter whether you're eating meat or you're not eating meat or you're vegan or vegetarian, it is everywhere. So what about the organic foods and organic everything? So how much of that is actually real. So do we follow the herd mentality and say, okay, I'm going to drop everything that is grown regularly, but I'm just going to do organic foods?
Yeah, that's more of an issue with what pesticides and herbicides are used. I think it depends largely on the farm. So organic can be very good. It's more expensive. It can be very good from a pesticide and herbicide point of view. I've not looked into the details of it in terms of how much antibiotic has worked its way into those soils. It may depend on what farms are next door, what farms are up the hill, that kind of thing.
I've got two questions
All right.
for you. The first one is in regard to the 50% of antibiotics being misused. Can you tell me a little bit more about that number? Are they being used for indications that aren't appropriate, or is that just part of the fact that our indications don't have really high specificity? So we're going to be treating some people for strep throat, meeting all the criteria, even though they don't really have strep throat, they're just carriers.
So it's a combination of both. It's mostly, number one, overuse of antibiotic when an antibiotic is not indicated. That's the most. And there are some studies that say 30%, and the CDC has put out closer to 50%. So overuse, that would be treating viruses with antibacterials. The other would be really the inappropriate dosing, the inappropriate duration, or you're treating the antibiotic, you're treating the infection, but you're treating it with an antibiotic that is not the optimal antibiotic. So augmentin for strep throat would be considered an inappropriate use of that antibiotic, and that pushes it up to somewhere in the 50%.
And who do you think are the biggest perpetrators of that, either nationally or in the Fairbanks community? Not necessarily particular doctors, but like where is this happening? Is this happening in emergency rooms, or?
I think it's happening everywhere. Primary care doctors for sure overprescribe. Emergency rooms overprescribe, and in the hospital we overprescribe. Do I overprescribe? I'm sure I do. There are certain situations that I'm willing to do the overprescription because our diagnostic tests have not caught up with us. And one of those situations is pneumonia in little kids. If we can hear a pneumonia in a little kid, I tend to treat that with the antibiotic. I know that probably 30 to 50% of those pneumonias are going to be due to a virus. But a kid cannot produce a specimen for us. A kid cannot produce the phlegm and have us test it. And in that situation, the alternative is do not treat the kid with pneumonia. And if the kid gets worse, then they're going to a stronger antibiotic. So I know, and I explain to people a lot of times, I say, I can't tell you if your child needs an antibiotic. I can tell you there's probably a 50% chance that your child needs this antibiotic. And that's just the state of technology today. It's not because I'm not smart enough to look through the chest and see the virus or the bacteria. So in those cases, overprescription is inevitable. We would like to bring that overprescription down to something that's a more manageable level. Potentially doing things like alternating medications. You saw that when we stopped a certain class of medications, C. difficile infections went down. Maybe there's a role for alternating immunizations over a period of time. We also have no infectious disease specialists in Fairbanks. We have some doctors that know more than others, but we have nobody who is a board-certified infectious disease specialist. So we rely a lot on telephone calls to Anchorage and Seattle, especially in pediatrics. We call Seattle a lot for anything that's a little bit touchy. We don't want to give the kid too much, but we don't want the child to die because we were trying to withhold. Antibiotic stewardship is not about withholding antibiotics from somebody who needs them. We just want to optimize the antibiotic use, the wisest use kind of thing.
In the days of the doctor coming to your house, I had a terrible sore throat, and it was a strep throat in probably 39 or 38, along in there. And that was the first time that I think the doctor had prescribed whatever it was for, what did they call it then? They didn't call it penicillin. They had another name.
Well, the first use that I've been able to find for penicillin was 1941. So I'm wondering if you got a sulfa medication.
It was sulfa, yeah.
So sulfa came out before penicillin. And the reason I didn't talk about sulfa a lot is it wasn't the miracle drug that everybody hoped for. There were more side effects, it was less pure, it was less stable, and they just didn't have the technology down yet. So you may have gotten the sulfa drug then.
Yes, I think it did, but it was like a miracle. The next day, I was almost well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was amazing.
If somebody, say, from already subarctic, lived up here most of their life, goes to the tropics, are they more susceptible to getting skin infections than somebody who's lived all their life in the tropics?
It's a real interesting question, and a lot of it seems to be racial or ethnic determinant. And what I mean by that is the Samoan people in Samoa got terrible skin infections, just horrible. And this led to a lot of them caused by strep, and this probably led to the high rheumatic fever incidence that they had. Samoan people who come to the United States have fewer infections because they're out of the tropics, but they have more infections than people who have lived here their whole lives who are white, black, or Asian. So there's something within the Samoan people that predisposes them to really bad skin infections. Americans, white, black, or Asian, who go to Samoa to work, get more infections in Samoa on the skin than they got here, but nowhere near as much as the Samoan people. So it was absolutely fascinating. And the Samoan kids got really, really sick from their pneumonias. If there was a kid from Samoa with a pneumonia, we actually gave them 2 antibiotics because it was the difference between keeping these kids out of the hospital or them being in the hospital. And the 2 years that I was in Samoa, these infections were so bad, they would develop pus between the lung and the rib cage. And probably every single month I was there was a kid with a chest tube hanging out of his chest, draining the infection. So antibiotics couldn't do all the job of curing this infection. That's where surgical intervention came into being, and we were able to drain the infection. But this was bad infections. So we were maybe a little bit more liberal there than we would be here. But as best I can tell, we were justified because we didn't want these kids to die.
I happened to be listening to a public radio program last night that was talking about antibiotic use in livestock. There was a University of Pennsylvania veterinary professor who was arguing that the use of antibiotics in livestock was not significantly responsible for antibiotic resistant bacteria. And I was wondering if you came across any evidence that the resistance that develops in farm animals is actually responsible for any infections that human gets. Are there zoonotic illnesses, or is it part of multi-drug resistant E. coli or MRSA, or the antibiotics that they're using in livestock, or those antibiotics that we use in hospitals, or is this just, we're just worried about it because we know it's out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't answer it specifically, but what I can say is that at the CDC, the maybe 2 biggest groups that I encountered there were the hospital infection group, and they do this epidemiology tracking diseases in whole hospitals all over the country and the world, and the foodborne illness group. And the program that I was in, this epidemic intelligence service, it trains doctors to go out and be the disease hunters, and the foodborne group takes, I think, 6 new officers every year. And that means over a 2-year fellowship, there were 12 student doctors working with potentially 30 or 40 fully trained medical epidemiologists. So foodborne outbreaks, the numbers of foodborne outbreaks in the United States are staggering. For the technology that we have in producing good food, these 12 officers were constantly busy in what they were doing. And this was the most sought after group at the CDC for these doctors to train under, because they knew they were going to be busy and they were going to get the coolest, weirdest, biggest outbreaks, and we're going to be tracking the food that we get from South America to Mexico, from the Middle East, from all over the world. And some of these studies they did were just absolutely amazing. And we're talking about, tens of thousands of people every year affected by foodborne illnesses. What percentage of that is due to antibiotics in animals? I just can't say. We know it's a